Hello, it's Steve Jamieson here, Managing Broker of RE/MAX Crest Realty Westside with your frequently asked questions. Today's question comes from one of our agents at the RE/MAX Masters location on the North Shore. And their question is, I have an investor client looking at buying a strata unit to rent it out. The seller is an original buyer from the developer and the listing agent is telling me that the unit is grandfathered, so my client can always rent it out, even if the strata corporation enacts rental restrictions in the future. Is this correct? And the answer is it may be or it may not be, but it really doesn't have anything to do with whether or not this purchaser was the original purchaser or not. It has to do with the date that the rental disclosure statement was filed. With the adoption of the Strata Property Amendment Act, the date that becomes key is December 31st, 2009. So for any rental disclosure statements that were filed prior to December 31st, on or before December 31st, 2009, then the only person that's exempt from rental restrictions is the original purchaser. And so if your client were to buy this and they enacted a rental restriction in 2 weeks or 2 months from now, then he would be affected. His current tenant, depending on what the bylaws say, the current tenant would probably be allowed to stay, but he wouldn't be able to get any new tenants in the property at all. For any rental disclosure statements that were filed on January 1st, 2010 or after, then the subsequent purchasers are not affected by any rental restrictions that are passed by the Strata Corporation. So the original purchaser and all subsequent purchasers would be allowed to continue renting the property until the end of the rental period, and that's defined in the rental disclosure statement. So very important for you as a buyer's agent, and even when you're listing it, to get this information and find out when was the rental disclosure statement filed and base your advertising and your marketing on that date. The other important thing is to find out when the end of the rental period is. Most developers, just like before December 31st, 2009, they were making the rental disclosure period 100 years, 1,000 years, so basically it never ended. But now, because of this change, a lot of developers, or not a lot, but there's several developers that are giving the opportunity back to the Strata Corporation to amend their bylaws and change it so that units can't be rented. And the way they do that is they make a very short end of the rental period. So instead of making it 100 years or 1,000 years, they make it 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. So if your client's an investor and he's buying it with the thought that he can always rent it out, he may still be affected by rental bylaw restrictions that are passed by the Strata Corporation if it's a very short period that they're allowing these unrestricted rentals. So if the rental period in the disclosure statement that's filed ends in 5 years, then at just over 5 years, your client would no longer be allowed to rent it out. And that may not be what he wants as an investor. So again, the critical thing is, when was it filed? And base your decisions on that. And keep in mind that stratas can still pass rental restrictions based on the period of time that a unit can be rented. So they may have restrictions where it has to be rented for a minimum of 6 months or a minimum of a year. They'll often do this to restrict Airbnb and short-term rentals. So they are still affected by that, even though they can rent it out. If you can't get a copy of the rental disclosure statement from the listing agent, you can always get it from the superintendent of real estate, and it's a $38 fee if you want to get it. So I hope this helps, and again, be very careful with the date of the filing of the rental disclosure statement. Any other questions? Please send them in.